The night Marshall Malone found the stitching, he was lying face down in the dirt of a dry canyon outside of Redemption, Texas, bleeding from a wound in his side that he could not stop with two hands pressed hard against it. The year was 1878, and the autumn sky above him was the color of old iron, no stars visible through the gun smoke that still drifted across the canyon like the ghost of something terrible. His horse was gone. Two of the three men who had ridden with him from town were dead. And Marshall himself was close enough to that same darkness that he could feel it breathing on the back of his neck like a second wind, cold and patient and utterly without mercy. He had been crawling toward the canyon wall for what felt like an hour, though it was likely no more than 15 minutes. His coat had been torn open when he fell from the saddle, the left side of it ripped wide at the seam, and as he dragged himself through the red dust, his fingers caught on something loose inside the lining. He stopped. He pressed his bloody hand flat against the interior of the coat. He felt thread. Not the rough industrial thread of the seamstress on Copper Street, not the factory stitching that ran along the seams. This was something else entirely, fine and deliberate, careful as a prayer. He pulled the lining back with fingers that shook from blood loss and not from fear, because Marshall Malone had long since made his peace with fear, and he looked at what was there in the faint and dying light. Pearl Lockhart, her name, stitched in small, perfect letters into the inner lining of his coat in thread the color of dark red, almost the color of the blood soaking through his shirt, and the sight of it cracked something open in his chest that the bullet had not managed to reach. He had ridden out of Redemption 3 weeks ago without a word of tenderness between them, without a promise made, without anything that should have given her reason to do something like this. And yet here was her name, hidden in the place closest to his heart, written in her hands into the fabric of the coat he wore against his skin every single day. He pressed his face against the dirt and breathed. He breathed again. He did not die that night, but to understand why that name meant what it meant, and why Pearl Lockhart had taken a needle and thread to the lining of a man's coat in the dark hours before dawn on a morning in early September, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to the day Marshall Malone rode into Redemption for the first time, carrying nothing but a federal badge, a dark past the size of a mountain range, and a reputation that walked 3 steps ahead of him like a warning nobody wanted to take seriously. Redemption, Texas sat in a shallow bowl of scrubland about 40 miles south of the Red River, and it had earned its name the way most things in that part of the country earned their names, through irony and desperation, and the particular humor of men who had nothing left to lose. In the summer of 1878, the town was fighting for its life against a man named Cutter Voss, who had come down from the Oklahoma Territory with 17 hired guns and a plan to seize the water rights to every well, spring, and creek bed within 30 miles of town. Water was everything in that country in that era. Control the water, you controlled the people. And Cutter Voss understood people the way a wolf understands sheep, not with affection, but with a cold and calculating appetite. The federal marshal assigned to the region had been shot dead in July. His deputy had resigned and ridden east in August. By the time the territorial commissioner sent word that a new man was coming, 3 homesteaders had already signed over their land under what most folks in town described as coercion at gunpoint, though no one could prove it in a court of law because the only witnesses were too frightened to testify. Marshall Malone rode into Redemption on a Thursday morning in the first week of September, 1878, on a bay horse named Corbett, with the morning sun behind him turning everything into long shadows and hard light. He was 28 years old and looked older, not in the way of a man worn down by life, but in the way of a man who had seen enough of the world's worst corners to have shed any remaining softness from his face. He had dark hair and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same limestone as the canyon walls outside of town, and his eyes were a deep gray-green that most people found difficult to read, which was something he had learned long ago to use as an advantage. He rode straight to the sheriff's office, tied Corbett at the post, and walked inside without knocking. Sheriff Burl Hankins was a large man gone soft around the middle, with a mustache that drooped at both ends and the eyes of a man who had been frightened for so long that the fear had become a kind of furniture, built into the walls of every expression he wore. He looked up from his desk when Marshall walked in, and the relief on his face was so raw it was almost embarrassing. "You the man they sent from Fort Worth?" Burl asked. "Marshall Malone," Marshall said. He did not extend his hand because both of his were occupied, the right one holding his coat back away from the badge on his vest, the left holding a document from the commissioner's office. He set the document on the desk. "Tell me everything." Burl told him everything. It took about 40 minutes and 2 cups of coffee strong enough to dissolve the tin it was brewed in, and by the end of it, Marshall had a clear picture of Cutter Voss, his 17 guns, his methods, his pattern of operation, and the particular vulnerability of the town, which was that there were not enough armed men willing to stand against him. Not because the men of redemption lacked courage necessarily, but because courage has a way of evaporating when you have children asleep in the next room and a wife who has not stopped crying in 3 weeks. "Is there anyone in this town worth having at my back?" Marshall asked. Burl thought about it. "Doc Whitfield is steady," he said. "And there's the Lockhart woman over at the dry goods store. She's not a fighter, but she's the sharpest mind in redemption. Knows everyone, knows everything, keeps her counsel. If you want to understand this town, you talk to Pearl Lockhart." Marshall filed that name away and thought nothing particular of it. He walked out into the street and got his first look at redemption in the full light of morning. The main street ran east to west and was wide enough for 2 wagons to pass with room between them. There was a hotel, a saloon called the Lucky Draw, a blacksmith, a feed store, a barber, a small wooden church at the far end, and tucked between the feed store and a vacant lot on the north side of the street, a dry goods store with a painted sign above the door that read, "Lockhart General Store Est 1873. He did not go in immediately. He spent the rest of that first morning making himself known in the way that a man in his position needs to make himself known, visible without being provocative, present without being arrogant. He had a system, built over 5 years of doing this kind of work in 3 different territories. You walk the perimeter before you walk the center. You let people see you before you ask them to trust you. You never arrive with a plan fully formed, because the country always knows something the Commission's reports do not. It was past noon when he pushed open the door of the Lockhart General Store, and the bell above the door rang out in a tone that was surprisingly clear and bright for such a dusty and sun-beaten establishment. The store was well ordered. That was the first thing he noticed. Not tidy the way a nervous person keeps a space tidy, straightening things compulsively to manage anxiety, but organized the way a competent person organizes a workspace. Everything in its place, because there is a logical reason for it to be there. Dry goods along the left wall in labeled bins. Hardware on the right, the nails and hinges and wire sorted by size. Bolts of fabric on the table in the center, arranged by weight and color. And behind the counter at the back, a woman who looked up from the ledger she was writing in with an expression that was neither welcoming nor unfriendly, simply attentive. Pearl Lockhart was 25 years old, and she had one of those faces that was not immediately beautiful in the way of portraits or parlor room paintings, but that became more interesting the longer you looked at it. The bones strong and well placed, the mouth slightly too wide, the eyes a clear and steady brown that had a quality of depth to them, as if they were measuring something in everything they looked at. Her dark hair was pulled back practically, and she wore a plain blue cotton dress and an apron, and there was a small smudge of ink on her left index finger from the ledger. "You are the federal marshal," she said. It was not a question. "Marshall Malone," he said. "I heard you came in this morning," she said. "News travels fast in small places. What can I get for you?" "Information, mostly," he said. Burl Hankins said you might be a useful person to talk to. Something passed across her face at that, not quite amusement and not quite wariness, but somewhere in between. Burl says that because he doesn't want to be the one who tells you the difficult things, she said. Sit down if you want. I'll put on coffee. He sat on the wooden stool at the end of her counter and watched her move to the small iron stove in the back corner of the store, where a coffee pot already sat. She poured without measuring, the way a person pours who has made the same coffee so many times the proportion lives in her hands rather than her head. Tell me about Cutter Voss, he said. She set the coffee in front of him and leaned both hands flat on the counter. Cutter Voss is patient, which makes him more dangerous than most people realize, she said. He is not going to ride in shooting. That is not his method. His method is pressure. Slow, consistent, escalating pressure. He puts men on the road outside of town who stop supply wagons and ask questions and sometimes damage goods. Accidental-like. He sends men into the saloon who drink too much and get into fights and make life unpleasant. He approaches landowners privately, one at a time, and the offer he makes starts generous and gets less so every time it is refused. And the violence? Marshall asked. Pearl's expression did not change, but something in her eyes shifted slightly, and he noticed it because he was the kind of man who noticed things like that. When the pressure fails, she said, then there is violence. But it is always done in a way that is difficult to prove was intentional. A barn that catches fire in the night. A wagon wheel that comes off on a dangerous stretch of road. A man who falls down his own porch steps and breaks his arm. You know a great deal about his methods, Marshall said. My father built this store in 1873, Pearl said. He died in 1876 and he left it to me. Cutter Voss sent a man to see me in July with an offer for the property. I told the man no. The following week, my supply wagon from Wichita Falls was stopped on the road and 3 crates of dry goods were destroyed. Cutter Voss sent another man to see me in August. I told him no again. She picked up her own cup of coffee and looked at him steadily. I have a hidden motive for wanting you to succeed, Marshall. I am not going to pretend otherwise. He respected that more than he could say. In his experience, the most dangerous people in any volatile situation were the ones who pretended to have no stake in the outcome. What is it you need from me? He asked. Information, she said, and the word came back at him with a faint edge of something wry. Specifically, I need to know if you are the kind of man who stays or the kind of man who rides out when things get complicated. He looked at her for a moment. I have never ridden out of a job unfinished, he said. That is not exactly what I asked, she said. He understood the distinction. And he did not answer it immediately, which she seemed to accept, because she moved back to her ledger and let the silence breathe between them without trying to fill it. And he found that quality in her, that ease with silence, to be unexpectedly striking. He left the store 20 minutes later with a detailed mental map of Redemption's social architecture. The names of the families who were most afraid, the names of the men who might still be persuaded to stand firm, and the name of Cutter Voss's most trusted lieutenant, a former military man named Silas Dunn, who handled the day-to-day intimidation while Voss himself remained at his camp 6 miles north of town. He also left with something he had not come in looking for, which was the beginning of a feeling he could not yet name and did not entirely trust. Over the next 2 weeks, the pattern of his days took on a rhythm that had Pearl Lockhart built into it almost before he noticed it was happening. He made his rounds of the town in the early morning. He met with Burl at mid-morning. He ate lunch at the hotel. And somewhere in the late afternoon, he found reasons to return to the Lockhart store, sometimes with genuine questions about town business, sometimes with nothing more concrete than the sense that the thinking he needed to do was better done in that space than anywhere else in Redemption. Pearl was not a woman who performed warmth. She did not flatter or charm or make herself easy in the way some women learn to make themselves easy around men who carried authority. She was direct and sometimes blunt, and occasionally, when she thought something he had decided was mistaken, she said so without apology. He found this deeply, unexpectedly refreshing. He had spent 5 years surrounded by men who told him what they thought he wanted to hear, and before that, a childhood defined by the particular brutality of adults who wielded power as a weapon, and somewhere in the machinery of Pearl Lockhart's practical honesty, something in him that had been held carefully in reserve for a very long time began to loosen. The secrets came slowly, the way real confidences always do. Not in a single revelatory conversation, but over many small exchanges, accumulating like the layers of a geological formation, each day adding its thin deposit of shared history and trust, until the structure between them was something neither had planned to build. He told her about the job in Abilene that had gone wrong in 1875, the one that had cost him his first partner, and given him the scar along his left ribs that he only mentioned when explaining why he tended to ride a certain way in the saddle. She did not offer sympathy so much as understanding, and there was a difference between the two that mattered enormously to a man who did not want to be handled. She told him about her father, a man named Joseph Lockhart, who had come west from Ohio with her mother and a wagon full of dry goods inventory, and the conviction that a man could build something decent in the frontier country if he worked hard enough and was honest about the terms of every transaction. Her mother had died of cholera in 1875. Her father had grieved himself into an early grave the following year. Pearl had been 23 years old, alone in the territory, running a business in a town where most people still found it remarkable that a woman could manage accounts and inventory without making a mess of it. "Were you never frightened?" He asked her one afternoon, about 10 days into his time in Redemption. They were on the porch of her store because the day was hot and the air inside was close, and she was mending something as she talked, her hands moving with the needle in the efficient and practiced way he had come to associate with her, everything she did shaped by a quality of focused competence that he found almost aesthetically compelling. "I was frightened every day for about the first 6 months," she said, "and then something shifted. Not that the danger went away, but I realized that the fear wasn't going to help me manage the inventory or calculate the margins or deal with the men who thought a woman alone was a negotiating advantage, so I set it aside." "Set it aside," he repeated. "Filed it somewhere useful," she said. "It made me careful. Careful is better than fearless in my experience. Fearless people get killed." He looked at her profile against the late afternoon sun, the straight line of her nose, the deliberate set of her jaw. He thought about how careful she was with everything, with her money, her words, her trust. And then he thought about how little such careful people usually trusted him, a man who moved through towns like weather, present and then gone, leaving things changed but never staying to see the long-term results. "You don't trust easily," he said. She looked at him then, a direct and unhurried look. "No," she said, "I don't." The situation with Cutter Voss escalated in the 3rd week of September. A rancher named Tom Elgin, who had refused to sell his water rights, and had been one of the men Marshall had been counting on to organize resistance among the other landowners, was found beaten badly on the road between his ranch and town. He survived, but his left hand was damaged enough that he would never work it properly again, and the message was as clear as a spoken sentence. The violence was moving from indirect to direct, which meant Voss was losing patience and losing it on a timetable, and that meant there was a reason for the urgency. Marshall sat with Pearl the evening after Tom Elgin was brought into Doc Whitfield's office, and they worked through it together at the small table she used for accounts, by the light of an oil lamp, both of them with cups of coffee going cold at their elbows because neither of them was drinking it anymore. "He's running out of time," Marshall said. "There's a water rights transaction window. The Territorial Land Commission closes its record books for amendment at the end of October. If Voss doesn't have control of those water rights registered and filed before then, he has to wait another full year." "How do you know that?" Pearl asked. "Wired the commission 2 days ago," he said. "Got the answer this afternoon." She looked at him with something that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it, and he understood that she had not been certain. He was tracking the legal dimensions of the situation as closely as the tactical ones. "So he has about 5 weeks," she said. "Less, accounting for travel time to file," Marshall said. "Which means the pressure is going to become something much more severe very shortly." Pearl folded her hands on the table. In the lamplight her face was all planes and shadows, and the ink mark was back on her left finger, or perhaps it had never entirely gone. "What do you need?" she asked. "I need the landowners to hold," he said. "I'm going to ride to the county seat tomorrow and file a formal complaint with the circuit judge about the Elgin attack. I need documentation from everyone Voss's men have approached, signed statements. I need those before I leave." "I can get those," she said. "Tonight, if necessary." He looked at her. "It's past 8 o'clock. "These people are not sleeping anyway," she said, and she was already standing, untying her apron. He rode out with her that night and spent 4 hours going house to house in Redemption, and to 2 of the nearest ranches, watching Pearl Lockhart sit with frightened people at their kitchen tables and speak to them in a voice that was steady and unafraid and deeply, genuinely respectful of their fear without being controlled by it. She knew what to say to each person, knew which argument would reach them, knew when to be quiet and let the silence do the work. By midnight, they had 7 signed statements. On the ride back into town in the dark, with the sound of their horses moving through the dry grass and the sky above them enormous and star-filled in the way it only gets in high, open country where there is no light to compete with the dark, he said to her, "You should have been a lawyer." She laughed, which was a sound he had not heard from her before, and it was a real laugh, unguarded, and it did something to the air around him that he felt physically. "In 1878 Texas," she said, "that is about as likely as being offered a seat at the United States Senate." "It shouldn't be," he said. "No," she said quietly, "it shouldn't." They rode in silence for a moment, and then she said, "Will you come back, after you go to the county seat?" "Yes," he said immediately, without thinking about it, which told him something about where he was. "Because of the case," she said. It was somewhere between a statement and a question. He turned to look at her in the dark, and he could see enough of her face to see that she was looking straight ahead, and that her shoulders were very carefully level, and that she was holding something in her expression that she was working to keep contained. "Not only because of the case," he said. She did not respond to that for a long moment. And then she said, "Be careful on the road," and something about the care with which she said it made him understand that the words were carrying considerably more weight than their surface meaning. He left for the county seat at dawn the next morning. He spent 2 days there, filed the complaint, met with the circuit judge, and arranged for an additional deputy to be assigned to the Redemption territory, a man named Carl Reeves who was reliable and not easily rattled. He wired the commissioner's office with a status report. He slept 4 hours each night and spent the rest of the time working through the legal strategy with the judge's clerk. And on both of those nights, lying on the narrow bed in the county seat hotel, he thought about Pearl Lockhart with an intensity that surprised him. Not in the way of a man who thinks about a woman he desires and nothing more, but in the way of a man who has become accustomed to a particular quality of light and finds its absence impossible to ignore. He thought about the way she worked, the way she listened, the way she said difficult things without apology, and carried her grief and her hardship with a dignity that was not performance, just the natural consequence of a character built on honesty. He thought about the forbidden quality of what he was feeling, because he knew what he was and what his life was, the moving, the temporary posting, the permanent violence of the work, and he knew what she was, a woman who had put down roots in a place and was fighting to stay in them, and the gap between those 2 lives seemed to him at 2 in the morning in the county seat to be the size of a canyon. But he came back. He came back on the 4th day, and when he rode into Redemption and tied Corbett at the post in front of the sheriff's office and walked to the Lockhart store and pushed open the door with its clear bell, Pearl looked up from her ledger and something happened in her face that was very brief and very carefully controlled, but he had been watching her face long enough to see it. It was relief, pure and uncomplicated and immediately hidden but real. "You came back," she said. "I told you I would," he said. She said nothing else about it, just turned back to the ledger, but the set of her shoulders had changed. Something had released. In the days that followed, things between them moved with a kind of inevitability that neither of them tried to accelerate or resist. It happened in the way that deep things happen between people who are both fundamentally honest, not in dramatic declarations, but in the accumulation of small choices. The decision to share a meal, the decision to sit a little closer than necessary, the decision to say the true thing instead of the easy thing, the decision to not pretend that what was building between them was something less than what it was. He walked with her to the church social on a Thursday evening and stood beside her in the way that made the women of the congregation raise their eyebrows and made old Burl Hankins hide a smile behind his mustache. He came to her store one morning to find that she had set aside a new pair of leather work gloves in his size, because she had noticed the ones he wore were splitting at the seam, and she charged him exactly what she paid for them, not a penny more, and he understood that this was its own form of intimacy, the refusal to reduce what she gave him to a transaction. He told her about his family, about the dark past he carried from a childhood in Missouri, a father who had been a violent man and a mother who had died too young, and the uncle who had taken him in at 12 and taught him that the law could be a force for something better than what he had known in that house. He told her about the betrayal in his second year as a deputy, a fellow lawman who had been taking money from the men he was supposed to bring in, and the particular damage that kind of hidden motive does to a person's ability to trust the people standing beside him. He told her these things in pieces over many evenings, and each time he did she listened without flinching and without offering false comfort, just witnessed them. And the act of being witnessed by someone whose perception he trusted completely was one of the most unexpectedly powerful experiences of his adult life. She told him about the man she had briefly been engaged to in 1875, a merchant from Wichita Falls named Gregory Hartwell, who had courted her with attentiveness and apparent respect, and had turned out, on closer and less romantic examination, to be primarily interested in her father's inventory and accounts. She had discovered this through the particular combination of a ledger she was not supposed to have seen and a conversation she was not supposed to have overheard, and she had broken the engagement immediately and quietly and had never spoken of it in town, not because she was ashamed but because she had no interest in giving the affair more space in the world than it deserved. "You were not broken by it," Marshall said. "I was furious," she said, "which is different." He smiled at that, and she saw him smile, and something in her expression softened in a way that was very private and very real. On a Friday evening in the last week of September, he came to the store after closing time and found her at the back table with a piece of deep blue wool fabric spread out in front of her and a needle in her hand. She was doing something careful and small with the needle, moving it in small, deliberate stitches along a seam. He sat across from her and watched, and she let him watch, which was its own kind of intimacy. "What are you making?" he asked. "Nothing dramatic," she said. "Mending mostly. And sometimes making small things that nobody sees. I find it steadying." He understood that. He had his own version of it, the habit of cleaning his revolver when his mind needed to settle, the repetitive and methodical work of it serving the same function. "My mother sewed," he said. He had not thought about that in a long time. "I remember sitting on the floor next to her chair and watching her hands. She was very fast." Pearl looked up at him then. It was not a pitying look. It was the look of a woman who was paying attention to what a thing costs a person to say. "She sounds like she was good at it," Pearl said. "She was good at most things," he said. "She didn't have enough time to do all of them." They sat in the quiet of the store for a long while, the oil lamp burning between them, and at some point he reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand over under his and held it, and neither of them spoke, and the silence between them was the most honest conversation he had had in years. October came in on a dry wind from the north that rattled the store windows and carried the smell of dust and distant weather. The situation with Cutter Voss moved toward its crisis the way a storm moves across open country, gradually and then all at once. On the 8th of October, Voss's men burned the outermost barn on Tom Elgin's property, the one that had just been rebuilt after the first destruction. It was not an accident, and it was not subtle, and it was clearly intended as a message that the signed complaints and the federal presence had not changed the calculation. Voss was doubling down. Marshall rode to Voss's camp with Carl Reeves and Burl Hankins the following morning, a deliberate and formal action, a documented visit on federal business, witnesses present. He delivered notice that the territorial authority was aware of the Elgin incidents, and that any further destruction of property or harm to persons would be treated as federal offenses with federal consequences. Voss received them in front of his camp on a roan horse with the ease of a man utterly certain of his own power, a broad-shouldered figure in his late 40s with cold blue eyes, and the particular dangerous confidence of someone who had never met a consequence he could not buy his way past. "I appreciate the visit, Marshal," Voss said, and the civility in his tone was perfectly calibrated, polished as a threat. "Tell me, how long does the federal government plan to keep a marshal stationed in this particular corner of Texas? Men like you don't usually last a full season before there's somewhere more urgent to be." "I'll be here until the matter is resolved," Marshall said. "Everything resolves eventually," Voss said. They rode back to town in silence, and Marshall sat with the exchange in his mind and felt the shape of the trap in it. Voss was right that the commissioner's patience for long-term deployments in quiet jurisdictions was limited, and if he could simply outlast the federal presence, he would be back to the slow pressure with no one to push against it. The forced choice was becoming clear. This needed to be resolved before the end of October, both because of the water rights deadline and because of the deployment calendar. He went to Pearl that evening and told her the truth of it. He did not dress it up or manage it. He told her that there was a hard version of the next 3 weeks coming, and that he was going to need the town to hold in a way it had not been asked to hold before. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "What are you not telling me?" He looked at her. "There may be a confrontation," he said, "a direct one. Voss is not going to fold on legal pressure alone." "Will you be in danger?" she asked. The question was very even, very controlled, but under the evenness he could hear something that was not even at all. "It's possible," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "All right." "All right," he repeated. "I can't ask you not to do the job," she said. "And I won't, but I want you to know something." She stopped. She looked at her hands on the table. "I have not let myself care about very many things in this life. The store, the people in this town, my father's memory." She paused. "I find that I care about what happens to you, Marshall." It was the first time she had called him by his first name. He had not realized until that moment how much he had been wanting to hear her say it. "Pearl," he said. She looked up. He moved around the table and took both her hands in his and looked at her for a long moment in the lamplight. All the careful, honest face of her, all the strength and the history and the warmth she kept behind the practical exterior, like something stitched into a lining where most people would never find it. "I am going to do everything in my power to come back from this in one piece," he said. "And when I do, I have something I need to say to you that cannot be said by a man who is about to walk into something dangerous, because it would not be fair to say it that way." She understood him. He could see that she understood him completely. "All right," she said again, but this time it was different. This time it meant something closer to "I will hold that for you until you can say it." He kissed her then, for the first time, gently and with tremendous care, and she held his face in both her hands and kissed him back. And for one long moment in that small lit store in the middle of the vast dark territory, nothing else in the world existed. The next morning, he began to set the pieces in position for what was coming. He sent Burl to the county seat with a specific message for the circuit judge about the conditions needed to trigger a formal arrest warrant for Voss and Dunn. He organized the men of redemption who were willing, 12 of them, not a small army, but enough for what he had planned. He identified the 2 properties most likely to be targeted in any escalating violence and arranged for continuous watch. He wired Fort Worth with a request for 2 additional deputies who might arrive within 2 weeks, faster if the judge's message moved efficiently. And in the evenings, he was with Pearl, and those evenings were both harder and sweeter than anything he could have predicted, because the approaching crisis put a quality of urgency on everything between them that concentrated the feeling to an almost unbearable intensity. They talked about the deep things, the ones that people usually only get to when they have known each other for years, because there was no longer any reason to pace themselves. They talked about what they wanted from their lives. They talked about what redemption might look like if this resolved well, and what it might look like for the people who had staked their livelihoods on staying. She told him about the small ambitions she had set aside over the years, the idea of expanding the store, of carrying more medical supplies, of building a small lending library in the back room for the children of the town. He told her about the version of a life he had imagined once and put away, a house, a piece of land, a reason to stay somewhere long enough to watch it change with the seasons. One evening he came in to find her doing the careful needlework again, and she was working on his coat, which he had left draped over the chair by the counter 2 days earlier, because one of the side seams had begun to separate. He watched her for a moment before she noticed him, her head bent over the work, the needle moving with absolute precision, and something in the image of it settled in him like a stone dropped into still water, spreading outward. "You did not have to do that," he said. She looked up unhurried. "I know," she said. "What are you doing to the lining?" he asked, because he could see she was working on the interior, not the exterior seam. She paused with the needle held still. A slight thing moved across her expression. "Reinforcing it," she said, and went back to work. He did not press it. He trusted her with his coat as he trusted her with most things, without needing to examine the particulars. The crisis broke on the 22nd of October. Voss moved before Marshall expected him to, which was either because Voss had better intelligence about the timetable or because his patience had finally given way to something more purely aggressive. At 9 o'clock in the morning, Silas Dunn and 6 of Voss's men rode into Redemption's main street and began the process of destruction that goes by the name of intimidation, but which is, in its bones, a kind of warfare against ordinary life. Windows broken. A cart overturned. The Lucky Draw Saloon's entrance blocked by 3 horsemen who turned customers away at gunpoint. Marshall was at the sheriff's office when it started, and he stepped into the street with the particular quality of stillness that is the opposite of calm, the stillness of a man in whom every faculty is fully engaged and fully ready. He had Carl Reeves at his right flank and 2 of the reliable townsmen at the periphery. He walked to the center of the street and faced Silas Dunn, who was a lean and sharp-faced man of about 40 with the eyes of someone who had been hired specifically for situations like this one, and who had never yet lost one. "Silas Dunn," Marshall said, loudly enough that the whole street heard it. "You are under arrest on federal charges of destruction of property, interference with commerce, and coercion under color of force. You and your men will dismount now and surrender your weapons, or I will carry this matter to a conclusion that will be considerably less comfortable for all involved." Dunn looked at him with the expression of a man who has been offered a negotiation he has no intention of accepting. "Marshal," he said, "you have 4 men to my 7. I would revisit the arithmetic if I were you." "3 of yours are already covered by men you have not seen," Marshall said, which was a partial truth and a partial bluff, but the specificity of it created a beat of uncertainty in Dunn's face that was exactly what he needed. What happened next happened quickly, and with the specific chaos that always accompanies the translation of a standoff into actual violence. the way a still surface fractures the moment the first stone breaks it. Dunn's hand moved. Marshall moved first. The exchange of gunfire lasted less than 30 seconds, but altered everything it touched, as 30 seconds of that kind always does. When the smoke cleared, Silas Dunn was disarmed and on his knees with Carl Reeves standing over him. 3 of Voss's men were riding hard out of town. 2 others had surrendered, and 1 had been shot in the arm by one of the townsmen in the rear position. Marshall was standing in the middle of the street with a graze along his left arm that was bleeding into his sleeve but was not serious, and with the very specific sensation of a man who has just gone through something where the gap between the outcome that occurred and the outcome that might have occurred was measured in inches and seconds. Pearl was at the door of her store across the street. She was not running to him, not because she did not want to, but because she understood, in the way she always understood the particulars of a situation before most people had processed the general shape of it, that a marshal in the middle of a just completed street confrontation could not afford to have the public see him being rushed toward by a frightened woman. She stood at the door of her store with her hands very still at her sides and watched him across the width of the street, and when his eyes found hers, she held his gaze for exactly the right number of seconds, and then gave the smallest, steadiest nod he had ever seen. He had done, and the 2 surrendered men locked in Burrell's jail by noon. He sent a wire to the county seat reporting the arrests and requesting federal transport within 48 hours. He sent a second wire to Fort Worth updating the commissioner. And then the second stage of the crisis arrived, because Voss himself was not yet in custody, and a man like Voss does not accept the loss of his lieutenant and his operation without a response, and that response, when it came without warning, as such things usually do. It came 12 days later on the 3rd of November. Voss had regrouped with his remaining men, a dozen of them including the 3 who had fled Redemption after the street confrontation, and in the early hours of the morning, word came through a boy from one of the outlying ranches that they were moving south. Not toward Redemption directly, but on a flanking line that put them heading toward the canyon country, and the reason for that route was that 2 of the landowners whose water rights Voss still needed had property that bordered the canyon. Marshall rode out before dawn with 2 deputies, Carl Reeves and the man from Fort Worth who had finally arrived 3 days earlier, a steady young man named Wells. He left Burrell in charge of the town with explicit instructions, and he left without waking Pearl, which was a decision he made consciously and which he knew she would understand, because telling her would have meant looking at her face, and looking at her face in the dark before riding into a trap would have made him carry something into the canyon that needed to be set down before he rode into it. The ambush in the canyon happened because someone had talked. He would find out later that it was one of the ranchers, a man named Prout who had been bought after all, who had told Voss the route and the timing. At the time, all he knew was that they rode into the narrow section of the canyon and the shooting started from the ridge above them, and in the first exchange, both Wells and the lead horse went down, and Carl Reeves was hit in the shoulder and retreating, and Marshall took a round in his left side that knocked him from the saddle and put him in the dirt with the canyon walls on both sides and the sound of Voss's men moving above him. He crawled. He pressed. He thought about nothing and everything. His coat had been torn open in the fall, the lining pulled wide, and as his bloody fingers moved across the interior of it in the dark of the canyon floor, they found the thread. Pearl Lockhart. Her name, stitched in small dark letters into the lining of his coat, close to the place where his heart beat, or where it had been beating, which he was increasingly uncertain about given how much blood was leaving his body. He pressed the lining flat with his palm and felt each letter under his fingers, reading them by touch in the dark, and the feeling that came through him in that moment was not comfort exactly. It was something more urgent and more specific than comfort. It was the feeling of someone saying, "I was here before you walked into this. I put my name next to your heart before you walked into this. You were not alone when you left, and you are not alone now." He made it to the canyon wall. He found a crevice in the rock that was just wide enough for a man to press himself into, and he held the wound in his side with both hands and stayed conscious through a combination of will and the particular stubborn anger of a man who has been told by circumstances that his time is up and who does not accept the information. He heard Voss's men searching the canyon floor for an hour, maybe longer. He heard them give it up as dawn began to gray the sky. He heard them ride north. Carl Reeves found him at full light, pale and barely coherent but alive, still in the crevice, still holding the coat closed over the wound with both bloody hands. "God above, Marshal," Carl said. "The coat," Marshal managed. "Don't let anything happen to the coat." Carl looked at him with the expression of a man confronting the specific kind of irrationality that shows up in badly wounded people. "All right," he said. "The coat is fine. Come on." They brought him back to Redemption on the back of Carl's horse. Marshall held upright by Carl's arm and by something else that could not be named precisely. And Doc Whitfield met them at the door of his office and got to work immediately with the competence and efficiency that is the specific product of frontier medicine, where you cannot afford to be fastidious about things that need doing quickly. Pearl was there. She was already there when they brought him in, standing against the back wall of the office with her arms crossed over her chest and her face absolutely still in the way that faces go absolutely still when the feeling behind them is too large to let any of it show. She watched Doc Whitfield work. She did not speak. She did not move. But when Marshall's eyes found hers across the room, she held his gaze with an intensity that was almost tangible, as if she was physically holding him in the world by the fact of looking at him, and he focused on her face the way a man focuses on a fixed light when the ground is moving under him. It took 2 hours. The bullet had not hit anything vital, which Doc described as either extremely fortunate or the specific mercy of a god who had decided that Marshall Malone had more work to do. There was significant blood loss, significant damage to the muscle of his side, and a minimum of 3 weeks of restricted activity before he could ride. This last piece of information Marshall received with the expression of a man told he has to give up whiskey, but he was in no position to argue with it. They moved him to the spare room above the Lockhart store because it was closer than the hotel, and because Pearl, who had approximately 0 patience for any alternative arrangement, made the case to Doc Whitfield with the quiet efficiency of someone who has already decided the outcome and is merely informing the other parties of it. Doc Whitfield, who had been in Redemption long enough to understand that certain conversations with Pearl Lockhart had a predetermined result, agreed. Marshall lay in the small room above the store and listened to the sounds of Pearl's work coming up through the floorboards below him, the steady movement of her, the particular rhythm of her days. He ran his fingers over the lining of his coat, which was folded on the table beside the bed, and he thought about her hands putting those letters there in the dark of some night before he rode out, careful and deliberate and completely private, an act of love that had never been intended to be found, or perhaps had been intended to be found only under circumstances that proved it necessary. On the second day of his recovery, when he was less pale and the pain was more manageable, and his mind was working clearly again, Pearl brought his noon meal up and sat with him while he ate, and he looked at her across the small table and said, "You stitched your name into the lining of my coat." She was very still for a moment. Then she said, "Yes." "When?" he asked. "The night before you left for the canyon," she said. "You came in late and left your coat on the chair when you went upstairs, and I worked in the store after you were gone, and I found myself with a needle in my hand." She paused. "I could not make myself say the words out loud. I did not think it was fair, before you rode into something dangerous, to say the words out loud, so I put them there instead, where you would only find them if something went wrong." He was quiet for a moment. "I found them," he said. "I know," she said. "They brought me back," he said, not metaphorically, not poetically. As a statement of fact about what had happened in the canyon in the dark, the thing that had kept his hands pressing the wound and his mind fixed on the surface of consciousness rather than sliding beneath it. Her name under his hand against his heart. Pearl Lockhart, the reason to hold on. Her expression broke open then, finally, after all the days of watching and waiting and holding it contained, and she reached across the table and took his face in both her hands with a tenderness that was entirely unguarded, and he reached up and covered her hands with his. "I have something I need to say to you," he said. "I told you before I left that there was something I needed to say but couldn't say it before I walked into something dangerous. You said it wouldn't be fair," she said, her voice not quite steady. "I love you, Pearl," he said. "That is the thing I needed to say. I love you, and I have been moving around for 5 years in a life that felt like the right shape for a man who had no reason to stay anywhere. And this is the first time in a very long time that staying somewhere has felt not like an obligation, but like the only thing that makes any sense at all." She was quiet for a long moment. The morning light came through the small window and lay across the table between them and across her hand still holding his face. "I love you too," she said. "I have been trying to manage it carefully for weeks because I was not certain what to do with it." "Stop managing it," he said. She laughed, and it was the real laugh again, the unguarded one, and he thought he could happily spend the rest of his life hearing that sound. "Marshall," she said, "if you are about to ask me something important, I will remind you that you are lying in a recovery bed with a bullet wound in your side. Then consider it asked in principle," he said, "with the formal version to follow when I can stand up straight and not look like something dragged in from the canyon." She shook her head, but she was still smiling, and she leaned forward and kissed him with both hands still holding his face, and he held her by both wrists and kissed her back with all the feeling that had been building since the first day he walked through her door and saw a woman who was measuring something in everything she looked at. The matter of Cutter Voss resolved itself over the following 2 weeks with the particular anticlimactic efficiency of legal processes properly applied. The circuit judge, galvanized by the documented federal offenses and the attempted ambush of a U.S. Marshal, issued warrants that could not be ignored. A contingent of federal deputies from Fort Worth arrived and executed the arrests on November 16th. Voss was taken into custody without violence, partly because he was a pragmatist who understood when a position was no longer tenable, and partly because 2 of his remaining men had already made deals with the territorial prosecutor that left Voss's legal position too exposed to fight from. He would stand trial in Fort Worth the following February and be convicted on federal charges of coercion, conspiracy, and assault, and sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. The water rights of the redemption landowners were secured. Tom Elgin rebuilt his barn for the 2nd time, and this time it stayed standing. Marshall sat in Pearl's store on the day the Fort Worth deputies rode out with Voss in custody, watching through the window as the procession passed, and felt the specific release of a thing that has been held in tension for a long time finally let go. "It's over," Pearl said. She was at the counter, back to her ledger, but her eyes were on the window. "Yes," he said. She turned and looked at him. They had talked about this moment, about what it would mean when it came, in the oblique and careful way that 2 honest people talk about things that carry a great deal of weight. She had not asked him directly what he would do. He had not offered a direct answer. But the conversation lived between them in every exchange. The fundamental question of a man whose work was defined by movement and a woman whose life was defined by staying, and whether those 2 things could find a shape that worked. He stood up from the stool and walked to where she was standing behind the counter. He stood on the other side of the counter from her, which was symbolic whether or not either of them intended it to be, and he looked at her for a moment. "I wrote to the commissioner," he said, "last week, before the Fort Worth men arrived." She waited. "There is a permanent position available in this district," he said. "Resident marshal assigned to a territory rather than moving between assignments. The pay is less." She said nothing, still waiting. I told him I wanted it, he said. Specifically this territory, specifically redemption. Pearl set her pen down very carefully on the ledger, and something in her face was doing several things at once. You are sure, she said. I have been sure since I was lying on the floor of that canyon with your name under my hand, he said. Pearl, I have ridden into enough places to understand the difference between the ones you ride through and the ones you ride home to. This is the one I ride home to. You are the one I ride home to. She came around the counter. She walked to him and stood in front of him and looked up at his face in the clear light of the afternoon, and then she said, Then stay. I intend to, he said. And the other thing, she said, the formal version you promised when you could stand up straight. He was fully healed enough now. The 3 weeks passed, the wound closed cleanly and Doc Whitfield having cleared him for all reasonable activities. He was standing straight, and he reached into the pocket of his vest and brought out what he had been carrying for 6 days, a plain gold ring that he had ordered through the mail 2 weeks before the Fort Worth men arrived, from a jeweler in Dallas, sized by asking Pearl's friend Mrs. Hobbs what size the woman's ring fingers were because he could not ask Pearl without giving away the whole of it. He held it in his palm and looked at her. Pearl Lockhart, he said, I would like you to be my wife. I would like to stay in this town and do this work and build a life here beside you. I would like to be the kind of man who gives you reasons to be glad I came back every single time I come back. She looked at the ring in his hand for a long moment. Then she looked up at his face. Yes, she said. Yes, Marshall. Yes to all of it. He put the ring on her finger, and she looked at it on her hand for a moment with an expression of pure, private wonder. That was one of the most beautiful things he had ever seen. And then she stepped into his arms and held him carefully, mindful of the still healing side. And he held her back and pressed his face into her hair and breathed. They were married on the 14th of December, 1878, in the wooden church at the end of Redemption's Main Street, on a cold and brilliantly clear Texas morning, with a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. Pearl wore a dress she had made herself from deep ivory wool that she had ordered from the fabric supplier in Fort Worth, and she had stitched the hem of it herself in the evenings in the weeks before the wedding, the same careful and precise needlework she brought to everything. And she looked like the most beautiful and most formidable woman Marshall had ever seen standing at the end of that short aisle. And when he said the words, his voice was entirely steady, and when she said hers, so was hers. Because they were both people who only said things they meant, and who could therefore say them without trembling. Burl Hankins cried, which no one in Redemption ever let him forget. Doc Whitfield proposed the toast at the small celebration afterward in the lucky draw, which had been cleaned up and decorated for the occasion by its proprietor, a cheerful and practical man named Archie Downs, who understood that a marshal's wedding was good for business and for the general morale of a town that had been under sustained stress for 3 months. The celebration lasted until nearly midnight, which was late by Redemption standards, and when they finally walked home through the cold, dark street together, their breath visible in the December air, her arm through his and his other hand covering hers, Marshall looked up at the vast and star-filled sky and felt something that it took him a moment to identify because it was not a feeling he had much practice with. He felt safe. Not in the small tactical sense of a man who has assessed his surroundings and found no threat. In the large and fundamental sense of a man who has found the place and the person where his life can stop being provisional. The spring of 1879 came to Redemption with a warmth that felt like the town itself was breathing easier, and in truth it was. With Voss in federal custody and his operation dissolved, the landowners who had been fighting to hold their properties through the autumn now had the room to plan and to grow, and there was a quality of energy in the town through those months that Marshall, making his morning rounds, recognized as the particular energy of people who have survived a serious threat and come through it with their essential things intact. He had his office now, a room next to the sheriff's office that the town had voted to fund properly from the municipal accounts, with a desk and a proper iron safe for documents and a telegraph connection that ran to the county seat. He and Burl divided the territory between them equitably, Burl handling the close-in-town matters with the steady, if somewhat fearful competence that had always been his, Marshall taking the wider range of the district, the outlying ranches, and the road between Redemption and the county seat, and the occasional matters that came down from the territory. And he came home to Pearl every evening, which was as extraordinary to him in March as it had been in December. The fact of the home, the fact of the woman in it, the fact that the word home had stopped being an abstraction. Pearl had begun the expansion of the store in February, using savings she had been accumulating for 2 years and a small credit arrangement with the bank in Wichita Falls. The vacant lot next to the store had been purchased, and a carpenter from the county seat was building an addition that would double the floor space, with room for the expanded inventory she had planned, and in the back corner where the light was best in the morning, a small reading room with a collection of books and papers that she was already assembling, contributed by people throughout the territory who had things to donate. She was busy, and she was, he could see, deeply happy in the specific way of people who are doing what they are made to do in the place they are made to do it, and watching her happiness had become one of the consistent pleasures of his daily life. By the summer of 1879, Pearl was carrying their first child, which she told him on a June evening when they were sitting on the porch after supper watching the long Texas sunset go through its colors, and the news arrived in him the way seismic things arrive, not with noise but with a deep and fundamental shift in everything. "Are you certain?" he said, which was not the most eloquent thing he had ever said. "I am a woman who is careful about determining things before stating them," Pearl said, with the faint quality of wry that he had loved in her from the beginning. "Yes," he said, "you are." He reached over and took her hand. "Pearl, this is one of the finest things that has ever happened to me." She turned and looked at him in the evening light with the full and unguarded quality of her love showing in her face without any of the management she used to apply to it, and said, "To me as well." Their son, Joseph Malone, named for Pearl's father, was born on the 17th of February, 1880, in the room above the store, delivered by Doc Whitfield with Marshall present throughout, because Pearl had informed him, and the doctor both, that she had no intention of going through something of that significance with only one of the relevant parties in the building. He held his son for the first time while Pearl rested, this small and surprisingly sturdy person who looked at him with the dark eyes of someone who has not yet decided what they think about anything, and felt something break open in him that had no equivalent in anything that had come before. Not even the night in the canyon, not even the wedding, just a complete and absolute love of the kind that does not require justification or explanation. They named him Joseph for Pearl's father, as she had wanted, and there was a quality of completion in that naming, a circle closed, the man who had built the store and the woman who had held it and the child who would grow up in both. Redemption in 1880 was a different place than the one Marshall had ridden into in September of 1878. The water rights were secured. The landowners were stable. 2 new families had come in from the north and set up businesses, a hardware expansion and a small medical supply shop that worked in partnership with Doc Whitfield. The reading room in Pearl's store was used by 12 children of the town on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, organized by Pearl with the systematic and energetic competence that she brought to everything she decided mattered. Burl Hankins retired in the spring of 1880 with a presentation ceremony in the main street that made him cry again, which everyone found both endearing and inevitable, and Marshall took on a deputy from the county seat, a young man of 22 named Henry Briggs who had good instincts and the rare quality of knowing when to listen and when to act, and who learned from Marshall with the particular efficiency of someone who has found the right mentor. The dark past that Marshall had carried into redemption did not disappear, because the past does not disappear, but it changed in character the way things change character when they are brought into the light and examined with honesty, looked at and named and set down without pretense. Pearl knew all of it now, everything he had carried from Missouri and from Abilene and from the years of moving, and her knowledge of it did not diminish him in her eyes, because Pearl Lockhart had always been the kind of woman who measured a person by what they chose to do with what they had been given, not by what they had been given. He told her once, on a night in the autumn of 1880, with Joseph asleep in his cradle in the corner, and the wind from the north against the windows, and the two of them sitting in the warmth of their kitchen, that the night in the canyon had changed something fundamental in how he understood his own life. He had spent 5 years understanding his work as a kind of personal penance, as if the law enforcement was the price he was paying for the childhood and the early adulthood, and the things he had done and not done, and failed to prevent. And lying in that crevice in the canyon wall with her name under his hand, he had understood, with the specific clarity that only extreme circumstances produce, that he was not paying a debt. He was building a life. Those were entirely different activities with entirely different orientations to the future. Pearl listened to all of this with her hands around her coffee cup and her steady brown eyes on his face, and when he finished she said, "I know. I could see it in you when you came back. Something had changed in how you held yourself." "When?" he asked. "In Doc Whitfield's office," she said, "when you looked at me from across the room." It was different from any look that had come before it. He looked at her now across the kitchen table in the firelight with the sound of their son breathing in the corner. "You see everything," he said. "I see you," she said. "That is different from everything." In the spring of 1882, Pearl told him about the second child, which she did at the breakfast table on a Saturday morning in May while Joseph, now 2 years old and entirely verbal and entirely opinionated about most things, was engaged in a complex negotiation with a piece of toast. Marshall heard the news and reached across the table and took her hand and looked at her with the same feeling as always, that fundamental and extraordinary gratitude for the fact of her, for the fact of this. Their second child, a daughter they named Clara after Pearl's mother, arrived in November of 1882 on a clear and cold evening, and was from the beginning a person of strong opinions and a tendency toward laughter that she expressed freely and frequently, and that filled the house above the store with a sound that was one of the best things Marshall had ever heard on a regular basis. The store had become, by 1882, one of the most successful enterprises in the territory, known not only for the quality and breadth of its inventory, but for the reading room, which Pearl had expanded and which now held over 200 volumes, and served the children of 4 surrounding ranches as well as the town itself. She had arranged for a teacher from Wichita Falls to come twice weekly to hold classes in the back of the store, and there was serious discussion among the town's residents about building a proper schoolhouse, a project that Pearl was organizing with the same systematic energy she brought to the store's accounts. Marshall, walking his district, making his rounds, sitting in his office with the telegraph clicking and the papers stacked on the desk, had become the kind of man who was trusted in all the ways that matter, not feared, not flattered, not maneuvered around. The landowners knew him by name. The families on the outlying ranches knew that he came when he was called and came quickly. The town of Redemption had taken his name into itself the way a place takes in a person who belongs there. He and Pearl walked together most evenings when the children were in bed and the day's work was done, through the streets of Redemption or out into the country beyond the last street, where the scrubland opened up into the vast and beautiful terrain that stretched toward the horizon in every direction, and the sky in the evening was the most extraordinary thing, turning colors that had no names in any catalog. They walked and they talked, and sometimes they walked in silence. the easy silence of two people who have nothing to prove to each other and no need to fill the space between them with anything other than the simple fact of being there. He carried the coat still, the one with her name stitched into the lining. He had worn it through several more winters, and when the outer fabric finally became too worn to repair properly, Pearl had very carefully unpicked the interior lining, in which her needlework remained perfect and undamaged, and stitched it into the lining of the new coat she made for him from deep brown wool she had ordered from the supplier in Fort Worth. The coat that carried her name was made by her hands and worn against his skin, and the transfer of that piece of the old coat to the new one was done one evening at the kitchen table with the oil lamp burning, and both children asleep, and a quality of quiet between them that was its own ceremony, more intimate and more meaningful to both of them than most ceremonies that require an audience. He watched her work the needle through the new lining, the same small, precise stitches, and he looked at her hands and her bent head and the fall of the lamplight on her profile, and thought about the September morning in 1878 when he had ridden into a town called Redemption, not expecting anything more than another temporary assignment in an endless series of them, and found instead the woman who would stitch her name next to his heart before he walked into danger and would carry him home from the canyon on the thread of 6 letters, Pearl Lockhart, his reason to press both hands against the wound and hold on and refuse the dark. By 1884, Redemption had a schoolhouse. The dedication ceremony was on a Saturday in April, and half the territory attended, and Pearl stood on the steps of the building she had principally organized the funding for, and accepted the town's gratitude with the same practical and gracious honesty that she brought to everything. And Marshall stood behind her with Joseph at his side, 6 years old now and very seriously interested in the proceedings, and Clara on his hip, a year and a half old and entirely indifferent to ceremonial occasions, and focused entirely on a button she had found on Marshall's coat lapel. Looking at Pearl from that distance, watching her speak to the gathered families of Redemption with the ease and the authority of a person who has earned the trust of a community through years of honest work and genuine care, he thought about the woman he had met in the store 6 years before, with her ledger and her careful eyes and her refusal to pretend away the difficult things. She was the same woman. She was also a woman who had grown into the full dimensions of herself in a way that was extraordinary to witness, and he was aware, with a kind of humble and complete gratitude, that some portion of that growth had been possible because she had a partner who saw her clearly and matched her in honesty, and did not require her to be smaller than she was. Carl Reeves came back to Redemption in the summer of 1884, retired from the federal marshal service and looking to settle, and he and his wife took up the property on the north side of town that had been vacant since the original standoff with Voss's men. He and Marshall fell back into the easy companionship of men who have been through something serious together and survived it, and Carl's presence in town added another layer to the fabric of the life that had been building there. Joseph Lockhart Malone, named for a man who had come west from Ohio with a wagon full of dry goods, and the conviction that something decent could be built in the territory if the work was done honestly, started school in the fall of 1884, and proved to have his mother's capacity for focus and his father's capacity for reading a situation before it had fully developed, which his teacher described as an interesting combination, and which Marshall and Pearl described in private and with equal measures of pride and mild apprehension, as an interesting combination. Clara, by contrast, was primarily interested in horses, and in the question of why certain rules applied to her that did not appear to apply to Joseph, and her conversations with her father about both topics were among the most entertaining of his days. In the evenings, after the children were in bed, and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, Marshall and Pearl sat together in the kitchen or on the porch depending on the season, and the life they had built was present in every detail of those evenings, in the sounds from the street where redemption went about its business, in the sounds from upstairs where their children slept, in the particular quality of the light and the air and the land around them, in the fact of Pearl's hand in his, and the fact that she was here and he was here, and this was the place they had chosen and been chosen by. He thought sometimes about the version of himself that had ridden into redemption in September of 1878, the man who had been certain that the shape of his life was a man moving through temporary places, and he had a great deal of compassion for that man, because that man had not been wrong about what he was. He had simply not yet discovered what he could become. The frontier country had a habit of revealing people, stripping away the provisional versions of themselves and leaving whatever was essential. And what had been essential in Marshall Malone was a capacity for depth and commitment and love that had simply been waiting for a context in which it was safe to emerge. Pearl had been that context. Pearl, with her careful eyes and her ink-stained fingers and her needle moving through fabric in the lamplight, building small, precise things that nobody saw, until the moment they needed to be seen, until the moment they mattered more than anything else in the world. The night he almost did not come back, and the name he found stitched into the lining of his coat, had been the hinge point of his life. The moment before it was one man. The moment after was the man who knew what he was holding on to and why. The man who had a reason to press his hands against the wound and stay in the world. The man who came back to redemption and to Pearl Lockhart, and who never left again in any way that counted. They had a third child in the spring of 1886, a boy they named Thomas, after Tom Elgin, who had held his property and his nerve through the worst of the Voss trouble, and who had become, in the years since, one of the steadiest men in the territory and one of Marshall's most trusted friends. Thomas Malone was born in April with the specific furious energy of a child who has decided to make his presence felt from the first moment, and Pearl, exhausted and laughing in the bed above the store while Marshall held his third child in the early morning light, said, "He is exactly like you." "I was never this loud," Marshall said. "You were exactly this loud," Pearl said. "You just used the inside of your head instead of your actual voice." He laughed, and the sound of it mixed with the sound of Thomas demanding attention and Joseph asking questions from the doorway and Clara attempting to climb the bed frame, and the whole accumulated noise of it was the most wonderful sound in the world. They walked out together onto the porch above the store when the morning was fully established, and the children had settled into their various occupations, and Thomas was sleeping against Pearl's shoulder, and they stood in the April light and looked out at Redemption, at the main street with its morning traffic, the riders and the wagons and the people going about the business of their days, and at the horizon beyond the edge of town where the sky met the land in a line so clear and definite it might have been drawn with a ruler. "Do you remember," Pearl said, "the first day you came into the store?" "I remember everything," he said. She smiled at that, the full and unguarded smile that had always been the rarest and the best of her expressions. "You sat on the stool at the end of my counter, and you looked at everything in the store with those gray eyes of yours, and you did not say anything unnecessary," she said. "I thought you were the most contained person I had ever met." "I thought you were the most formidable," he said. "You did not show it," she said. "I was practicing not showing things," he said. "I have mostly stopped practicing." She leaned against him, and Thomas made a small sound between them, and the morning went on around them. Redemption going about its life. The town that had given them both everything, that had been the place where a federal marshal with a dark past, and a woman with a needle and thread in her father's store and her mother's stubbornness had found each other in the middle of a crisis, and built something real from the materials of honesty and time. Pearl Lockhart. His name for her was not the formal one, not Mrs. Malone, though she wore that too with the same practical ease she wore everything. His name for her was simply Pearl, and when he said it, which was often, it carried 6 years of accumulated meaning, the name stitched into the lining of a coat, The name under his hand in a dark canyon on a November night when the gap between staying and going had been the width of a breath. The name that had called him back across that gap and kept calling him back. Every day, every evening, every morning when he woke in the house above the store and reached out and found her there beside him. She turned and looked at him now, in the April light, with their son sleeping between them, and there was nothing in her expression that was managed or contained or held in careful reserve, just the full and steady and entirely present love of a woman who had put her name next to a man's heart before he walked into danger and had never taken it back, and who had no intention of ever taking it back, because she had been very careful and very deliberate about where she put her name. And she had put it exactly where it belonged. Marshall, she said. Pearl, he said. They stood in the morning with everything they had built around them and everything they had come through behind them, and the land stretched out to the horizon in every direction, enormous and various and full of the specific hard beauty of the frontier country in 1886, a country still defining itself, still working out the terms of what it would be, and in the middle of all of that definition and working out, in a town called Redemption in North Texas. A man and a woman and 3 children who had each other in the full and permanent and unassailable way of people who chose one another not once, but every day. The coat hung on the hook by the door of their home, brown wool against the wood, and in its lining, in small dark thread, the 6 letters that had been the beginning of all of it, stitched there with care and love and the particular kind of faith that asks for nothing in return but cannot help offering everything, Pearl Lockhart, the name of the woman who had known him well enough to put it there, the name of the woman who had always known exactly where it belonged.